Hi, this is Jesper from Velocitypeak, and this is part one in a two-part tutorial. And I'm going to show you how I made this. Let me play it back. Okay, and the part we're focusing on today is the plane displacement here, the little cubes that displace the plane. Here's a different camera angle. So that's what we're going to focus on today. And I'm using Cinema 4D and XParticles. I rendered this with Cycles 4D, but you could use Redshift or Octane. The same principles would apply. And if you want the project files, you can find them on velocitypeak.com. Let's start. Okay, so let's start. Let's start by adding a plane. Add a plane, drag that underneath the logo, and let's make it bigger, 1600 by 1600. Let's display the geometry. So display Garud shading lines. So we're going to clone cubes onto the polygon faces of this plane later on. So the amount of polygons that we have is going to dictate the look. And in general, the smaller the cubes, the better it looks. So the more geometry you need. In the example I showed you, I used 200 segments. For the sake of speed in the tutorial, I'm just going to make this 100 by 100, which should suffice. Now we don't need to see the lines anymore, so let's turn them off. And I'm going to use XpCloth to turn this plane into a cloth. So let's go to XParticles, Dynamic Objects, XpCloth Effects, Create Cloth. And if we play this back now, the plane just takes off to the ground. And that's because XParticles has created a couple of things for us. The plane itself has a cloth deformer with a tag attached to it. We have XP constraints enabled, and it has collisions enabled. We don't necessarily need that for this example. We're not going to use it as a cloth itself, so I'm going to turn it off, save some speed. And it added a gravity modifier, which is forcing the plane to fall down. And then we have an emitter, and it attached particles to each point on this plane, and then we have a cloth modifier. So let's rewind to the first frame, and I'm going to turn off the visibility of the emitter. We don't necessarily need to see it. And I'm going to use gravity in this scene, but I'm going to use it with a negative amount. So it's going to shoot upwards. So now it's taking off upwards. But I don't want the entire thing to just take off. We need to pin this to the ground to work. And the way I'm going to pin this is if I go to the plane, I'm going to make a duplicate of this plane, and I'm going to make that plane editable, and I'm going to pin the points of that plane. So it's important that that plane remains the same, so it has the same amount of subdivisions. So let's make a copy of this. Control drag this up and delete the cloth deformer on this one. And let's call this one plane. And I'm going to call this VM for vertex map driver. And I'm going to call the original plane just plain cloth. And let's temporarily hide the cloth. And let's make this plane editable now. You can either hit C or click on this button. So now this is a polygonal object. So we can access the points. So let's go to points mode. And I want to select the edges, the outside edges. And the best way to do that is to use the loop selection tool. So we can find it under select, loop selection, or just use the shortcut UL. And I want to select the outside edges. And it's selected for me. And that's because I have select boundary loop enabled. And then select those. And then go up to select, set selection. And now we have our selections. I'm going to name this selection edges. And the way we use this selection is to go into the cloth tag. and then we have an advanced tab, and then we have a pinning option. And we need to drag the selection in here. It would also work with a vertex map. So I'm going to take this point selection, drag it in there. And then let's hide this, the vertex map driver plane. And let's turn on the actual cloth so we can see this. Let's play this back. Okay, so now you can see that the edges are pinned to the ground, which is what I want. So the next step is to create the little lanes that's going to come from the outside and go towards the center of this cloth. And we're going to use a vertex map to do that. So let me go back to the first frame, and I'm going to turn off the visibility of the cloth plane again and get this plane visible. Gonna go into polygon mode, and I want to make sure that nothing is selected, and then we can go up to select and then set vertex weight, and we want to make sure we set that to 0 and then click OK. So now we have a vertex map, and just gonna call this one VM vertex map for distortions. Distortion map. And let me click away. I don't want to see the polygon objects. I'm just going to click on the vertex map itself, so it's just a red. Okay, so the way we're going to use the vertex map now is by inside of the vertex map, we can use fields. And when we enable fields, it's going to give us a freeze layer. We don't need that, so let's delete that. Instead, let's make a shader field. And in the shader field, I'm going to go to the shader here and add a gradient. So something is happening. Let's go into the gradient, and instead of a 2D U, I am going to use a 2D radial. One of those ones that you don't necessarily use all the time, but it's very useful in this example. I'm going to pull these a little tighter. I'm going to control click on this black knot to make a copy. So this essentially creates the section. And I want it to be fairly thin, something like that. And the location on this bar is going to dictate where the vertex map is going to be. So if I drag this, I can now place it wherever I want. And the good thing about release 20 is that you can select multiple knots at the same time, move them at the same time. And with these highlighted, if I control drag again, I can make a copy of this. So put one, say, for example, there. Put one here. Maybe put one over there. Delete that one. Don't need that. Maybe make some modifications so they're not all too uniform, but I want them fairly tight though. I don't want them to be too thick. But let's say that that is good. Okay, so how do we use this vertex map now? Well, we are going to use it inside of the gravity and in the fall off. So I'm going to take the vertex map, not the shader field, the vertex map, drag it into the fall off. And if I hide the vertex map plane and get our plane cloth back, play it now, you can see that it's working. It's showing up right away, but it's working. We get those sections. So we don't want it to turn up right away, so we need to animate these on. And how do we do that? Well, let's go back to the vertex map. Let's hide this cloth again. Let's bring back the vertex map. And I'm going to create another gradient. So I need to drop this entire gradient into a layer shader. And in the layer shader, let's add another gradient. And let's go into that gradient. And this time I'm going to use a circular. And I'm going to take this black knot, drag it all the way to the edge here. Now the distance between the black and white knot is going to dictate the how soft of a transition you get, but I'm going to have a fairly harsh one. I'm going to go almost all the way out to the edge. So now we're going to animate this gradient. If I select both, you can see what's going to happen. I'm going to animate it going towards the center. So let's start here. And on frame 0, let's set a keyframe in the gradient. And I'm going to go to frame 100. I've shifted my timeline. Normally this is 90, but if you set this up to match mine, 150 frames. So let's go to frame 100. Drag both knots into the center. Now there's going to be a logo in the center, so somewhere around there looks good. And then we click this keyframe button again, and we can play this back. Now it's playing back a little bit slowly because the emitter is still active, although we're not using it. So we can temporarily just turn it off, turn off the emitter, so we can just see the vertex map a little quicker. So there you have it. So let's see what that in itself is going to do. Let's turn off the visibility of the vertex map, bring back the cloth, and play that back. So that doesn't work, and that's because I forgot to turn the emitter back on. So let's turn the emitter back on and try again. Okay, so that works. The animation works. But of course, we're not revealing the lanes. We are just bringing in the circular gradient, which could work as a reverse shockwave or something, perhaps. But let's go back into our vertex map and make a few changes. And again, let's turn off the emitter so we can operate a little quicker. Let's go to a frame where we can see it, say around there. Let's go back to the shader field, and inside of the layer, let's drag this gradient to the bottom and switch the layer mode or the blending mode to layer mask. And that is now revealing the lines here. So if we hide this again, bring back the cloth, make sure to enable the emitter this time, and play it back. So it's working. Now the effect is fairly subtle, so let's make a few things to adjust that. The first thing I'm going to do is that in the gravity, we have the strength is minus 981. I'm going to whack that right up to minus 8,000, which is going to give us a more dramatic effect. So it's increasing it. It's still not there yet. And we're going to go to the tag, the cloth tag, and in the cloth settings, the iterations is acting almost as like a stiffness slider. So the higher or the more iterations you have, the stiffer is going to become. But I'm going to take this down to 1, and this is going to look very different now. So now it's billowing like a pillow or something. Now that's too much, but I'm going to constrain that a little bit by using the dampen. If I bring that all the way up to 100 and play that back, it becomes too rigid. But if I find the middle ground somewhere around 45, which I think is what I used, and I think we have something that's going to be pretty good. So I think that's pretty good. Now, what I would like to do though is, instead of it being so even, I want to introduce some turbulence into this, some unevenness, just to yeah, just to break up the perfect lanes. And to do that, of course, we go back to our vertex map. So once more, let's hide the cloth, go back to our vertex map. Let's disable the emitter for now and click on the vertex map. So I'm going to do two things. I'm going to go into the layer. And the first thing I'm going to do is to go into this gradient, and we can add some turbulence right here. So maybe add something like 10. 10 goes a long way there. Let me go up one level. And then I'm going to add a little bit of noise on top as well. So shader, noise, and I need to change the blend mode to multiply. And that's a little too much. See, it's cutting little holes in our little lanes there. So let's go into the noise and increase the scale to say 400%. Let's increase the contrast a little bit. Let me pull this up so I can see the low clip and the high clip. Okay, so I think that's pretty good. I'm gonna lower the strength of that one just a little bit. And then let's see what we get. Let's enable our emitter again. Hide the VM plane, bring back this cloth, and see what we have. So that's definitely less uniform, and I like that. I think that is pretty good. I'm gonna stick with that. I'm gonna play that one more time. Okay, so that's the base. So now that we have that, I'm gonna turn off the visibility of the plain cloth. We don't need to see it anymore. We're just using that as a driver for the matrix. So I'm gonna go up to MoGraph and a matrix object. And because I'm gonna render this with Cycles 4D, I can use a matrix, and then at render time, I can just replace the matrices with geometry. And you could do that if you're using Redshift or Octane or other render engines. If you are planning on doing this with a physical renderer, then you would have to use the cloner instead. But I'm using Cycles 4D, so I'm going to take the matrix, and I want that to be the last object. And I'm going to set the mode to object. And the object I want is the plain cloth. So we have something. We need to change the distribution to, instead of surface, let's set that to polygon center. And now we can see that we actually have the shape. And if I play this back, you can see now it's all flat. But as we play this back, the matrices are deforming and conforming to the cloth. To see this a little bit better, let's change the scale of the matrix. We have to change the scale of the geometry later on, but just to get a better sense, let's go to the Transform tab. I'm going to click on the letter S. It's going to highlight the X, Y, and Z. I'm going to put the cursor in there and use my arrow keys. And if I hold down the control, it's going to make changes to all of them at the same time. And if I add the shift key, I can increment this a little more. So now that's pretty close to what I want. If you want fine control, you can add control and alt. But I think that is a pretty good approximation of what we want. So the idea is that when they are distorted, I want them to show up as little cubes. But when they're not distorted, I want the illusion of one cohesive mass. So I actually need to bring this up a little bit more. So control up arrow a few times. So that's kind of what I'm going for with this. And we have to adjust this within the material later on as well. But this is a good start. Okay, so let's move on and add light and textures to this. Now, when we render this with Cycles 4D, I'm gonna render it with a cube, a single simple cube. So let's go ahead and add that right away. And I'm gonna call this one cube for matrix, and that's a big cube. Not sure exactly what size we need for this, but I'm gonna reduce this to say 1 by 1 by 1 for now. And this is gonna show up in the render, so I wanna move it, just gonna drag it out of view here so we don't see it. Maybe I could just add a big number to that, say 10,000. So we won't see it, but it can still show up in the render for us. Okay, so on the matrix, I am gonna add a tag. I'm gonna add a cycles 4D tag, and I'm gonna add a cycles instance, which is gonna enable us to use that cube when we render now. So let's set up a few lights to begin with as well. So cycles 4D, I'm gonna add a light, and I'm gonna use a target light for this. So I can add a target tag to my light. So right click on that and go to Cinema 4D tags and use a target. And I'm gonna use the logo that we can't see. The logo is right there in the center, right there. So I'm gonna use that logo as the target for the light. So in the sloth, the target object, let's drag in the logo. And then I'm going to turn off the visibility again. Don't need to see it. Twirl it up. And the settings for the light, if I click on this icon, I don't want it to be a point light. I want an area light. And let me call this one light, right, and blue. I'm going to make this a little blue, and it's going to sit on the right side. And let's go back to the settings for it. And I'm going to have a pretty intense light. I'm going to set this right up to 3000. And I'm going to make it lightly blue. We can't see anything yet, but it'll show up a little bit later. Let's just make that a little bit blue. Probably come back and adjust that, but for now, that's good. And I'm also going to make this a lot larger. So the X I'm going to set up to 1600. So let's pull out here a little bit. And I'm going to place the light around here pretty high up. So let me get my object axis, and it's pointing towards the logo. And we can see that it's fairly large. Let's bring up the 4 views by hitting F5. And I'm just going to drag this up so it sits somewhere around there. This is a starting point. Good. And then I'm going to make another light. So I'm going to make a duplicate of this one. So control, drag this one right up. And this is going to be the left one. Light. In fact, left and just orange. And let's make this light just a little bit smaller. Say 1000, doesn't have to be that big. Make it a bit of an orange hue. Drag it to this side. And we're gonna lift it up. And okay, so that's good for now. Let's go back to our normal layout. So F1. And let's bring a different layout to this. So I'm gonna set this one up for this layout, tutorial cycles. So let's just hit play and see what we get. Okay, so we have something. If I zoom into this now, though, it doesn't quite look right. And if I go into the matrix and that tag, the instance tag, and what we actually see right now, they're too big to see the individual ones, but we have little spheres. So we have a size multiplier. So if I reduce that to say 25, you can see that right now we have a bunch of little spheres. But we want to use the cube that we made. So we need to drag that into this object slot. And let's take the cube that we created, drag it into that slot, and now we have little cubes, although they're too small to see. So let's bring up the size multiplier to 100. Okay, so we need to make some changes to our cube. It's just too small. So let's go to the cube, and under the object tab, let's try 5 by 5 by 5. It's pretty close. Let me do the same thing as before. I'm gonna put my cursor in the field, use the control and up arrow. And then I'm gonna go down by using the control and alt, which is gonna allow me fine controls. And I think 5.7 is gonna be quite good. If I zoom out, let's get a better idea. I think that's good. Now we don't have a material, so let's go ahead and create a material. And in this layout, I have the materials here. So let's go to Create, Cycles 4D, and then Object Material, which creates this principal BSDF for us. Let's take that one and drag it to our cube, not the matrix, the cube. And let's call this one cube mat. And in the cube mat material, let me get some space here because I want to make the adjustments down here. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make this metallic. And now it completely disappears. We only see the reflections, essentially. I'm also going to make it a little darker, so say around 60%. It's pretty good. Now, to see this a little bit better, I'm going to add some roughness. Just a little bit of roughness so that we get our thing coming back. So that's the base material. Now there's a main problem here, and that's the fact that this is just a simple cube with flat edges. You would normally see in these areas, you would normally see that the edges should catch a little bit of that highlight. And because this is a flat cube, that doesn't happen. Now, we're going to add the beveling within Cycles 4D. We're going to use one of the nodes here. And if I right click and say input, we have a bevel node. And the bevel node goes straight into the normal channel. And we have a bevel, it's very large. Now the bevel node, you need to use really tiny values for this. So 0.01 is more like it. And now you can see that we are catching highlights on these areas. Now, of course, the problem then is that it's catching highlights here as well. We need to find a way where we can have the cubes beveled only when they are distorted, when they're not at their default location. And there's a way to do that. And let's look at that in a different file to show you. It's easier to show in a different file. So I'm going to go to a different window and bevel variation. Okay, so let me show you the setup here first. So let's go change the layout to this layout. And the setup is very similar. I have a matrix object, and the position of the matrices is being randomized by a random effector. And I have a linear field set up so that this matrix on the left side is not affected, but the other ones are. So their position on Y is going up and down based on this random field. So let me go back to a cycles layout. So if I play this now, I need to add a material first. So if I play this now and zoom in, or start the real-time preview, I should say, you can see that there is a bevel there. These clearly are beveled, whereas this one doesn't have a bevel. And if I go into my random field and reduce the strength to 0, none of them have a bevel, but as they move away from their original position, they are beveled. So let's set that up. Let's stop this and let's build this material from scratch. So create Cycles 4D object material. And again, here is our principal BSDF. And let's, first of all, let's drag this to the cube. And let's play this. And to make this a little easier to see, I am going to make the material a little darker. Just going to be easier to see that way. And then let's bring in, right off the bat, let's bring in the bevel node. Bevel. Pipe that into the normal. And reduce the radius to 0.1 or 0.01. And I'm going to up the samples, the quality of the bevel essentially. And okay. And then we want to keep track of the Y position. And there's a node for that. So if I right click and say input object info, we have a position. We don't care about the X, Y, and Z. We only care about the Y. So we can get a converter and then, oops, we can get separate X, Y, and Z. And if I pipe that in here now, we can see what's going on. Now, a really nice feature of Cycles 4D is the ability to solo a node. So if I click on the word or the letter Y, we get a grayscale representation of what's going on. And this is really helpful as you build your node systems. Okay, so let me unsolo that. So I'm going to add a few different math nodes here. And then converter math, and I'm going to put in the Y value here. And this first node, I'm going to set to multiply. And this, in the end, is going to act as a threshold node. And I'm going to increase the value to 100 now. We won't see a change right away, but we will later on. And then I'm going to add another node. And let me pipe that value in there. And this node, I am going to set to round. And this is going to round values to integers. So 0.6 becomes 1, and 0.4 becomes 0, and so on. And then I am going to clamp this because I only want values between 0 and 1, actually. And then I'm going to take this and I'm going to just control drag to make a duplicate of that. And I'm going to drag this value into this value and switch this to a multiply. And this is going to be the strength slider in the end. So I'm going to set this back to a 0.1 that we had before. 0.1. And then I am going to drag this into the radius. And now you can see that we have the beveling going on these clones here. And if I go back to my random effector now and turn off the strength, the bevel goes away. So remember what I said, that this first node, which is currently set to 100, is the threshold slider. If I highlight value, I can see that right now they're almost white. But if I reduce this value to 10, you can see that we have more of a variation. This is the brightest and these are less visible. And if I unsolo that, you may or may not be able to see that. But look at this clone right here. If I increase this value to 100, it is now also beveled. So this becomes a threshold to how far can they travel away from their original position before they are beveled. And then the last slider here is the one that controls how much of a bevel they're going to get. So if you increase this to keep doing that, 0.2, then you're going to have a bigger bevel. Now, in general, you want small values for this, so I'm going to leave it at to keep doing the same mistake. So 0.01. Now, there's one thing we can fix, and you can see that the beveling is working for the top clones. However, for the ones at the bottom, it's not working. And the setup that we have, that wouldn't be a problem because they're mainly traveling upwards. However, if you want to have these be affected by the bevel as well, then we can do one more thing, and that in the separate XYZ, I think because we have values, the Y position has positive and negative values. It's only working in one direction. But if we add another math slider, a convert math, and then instead of add, let's set this to a, where is it? We want absolute. There you go. So now if we pipe that in as an absolute, now everything is being affected because the value is the same. There's no negative values coming out of this one anymore. So that's the setup. So now let me rename this object material to matrix cube MAT for mat. I can stop the interactive real-time preview. I'm gonna Control C to copy that material. Let's go back to our file, and I'm gonna delete the original cube mat. Instead, I'm gonna Control V to get the new one in. I need to make a few changes though, and we had this material was a little brighter, so I think 60. And then metallic. And then we also had some roughness. Let me, in fact, do that here. It's a little cramped, but we can get by. So roughness down here, so 0.2. That's what we had before. So let's play this now and see what we get. And that looks really, really bright. And that's because we have gone back to the default material since we forgot to drag the new material onto the cube. So let's do that. And now we have it. I'm going to make this larger now so we can see. Let's zoom in. So let's see what we have. I think if we simply disable this bevel, see what we get then. Okay, so it looks like that. Let's bring this one in. So let's see what we can do. Now, I don't want this to have the bevel. So let's go and see if we can simply change the threshold. Let's try that first. So let's set the threshold to, say, 10. And that looks a little bit better. We may also want to change the size of the cubes. Maybe the cubes are just a little too large. Oops. And I think I'm going to do that. So let's go to the cube. And instead of 5.6, let's make that 5.7. Let's make that 5.6. 5.6. Actually, I want the opposite. 5.8, 5.8, and 5.8. Let's see. Okay. Okay, so I think that's quite good. So the ultimate framing perhaps will be something like this. Let me zoom out so we can see the entire thing. And now we're gonna play with the light. So let's rewind and let's play this back. So when we have nothing, we have this kind of look. As the cubes come in. You can see that they show up. And we can see that they're beveled. Now I want to change the light. We're getting the hot spot here, which I like, but I want to have more hot spots around here. So this is just adjust to taste, essentially. Let me bring back the 4 views again so we can adjust that. So let's adjust this light first. Maybe pull this up a little bit. I think that's better. See if pull it up a little bit more. Something like that. Then let's go for the other light. Pull this one up even more, maybe a little closer. something like that. I mean, this is all to taste. Let's play a little longer. Okay, let's go back to one view. Let's try a different angle. And now, of course, we could also try to adjust the bevel here, so we get more or less of an effect. This is the strength slider. If we do 0.5, it's going to be very intense. If we do 0.5, maybe it's more appropriate. I think still 0.01 is pretty good. I'm going to leave it at 0.01. Okay, so that's the base setup, and you can tweak that to fit your projects. And I'll be back with another video soon of how I set up the explosion. All the project files are available to download on velocitypeak.com, and you'll find details below this video. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.